All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a question that sounds super simple, but is actually one of the oldest and deepest questions out there. What is law? I mean, really, what is it? It seems obvious, but as you're about to find out, the answer is anything but simple.
And to really get to the heart of this, let's start with a question that has tied philosophers in knots for centuries. Is an unjust law still a law? Seriously, think about that for a second. If a government passes a rule, but that rule is just fundamentally wrong, does it still count? Is it still a legitimate law that you have to follow?
You know, this isn't just some abstract thought experiment. It has real life-or-death consequences. A perfect example is the famous Nazi grudge informer case. So during the Third Reich, a woman wanted to get rid of her husband, and she used a Nazi law that made it a crime to insult Hitler. She reported him to the authorities, and he was sent off to the front lines. But then, after the war, she was the one on trial, and her defense was chillingly simple. Hey, I was only following the law. So, what do you do with that? Was she a criminal, or was she just being a law-abiding citizen under a terrible regime?
See, this one case just blows up any simple definition of law. It forces us to look at this massive philosophical split. The court's decision and how we feel about it really depends on how we answer that first big question. And this dilemma basically gives us two major competing schools of thought. In one corner, you've got natural law. This theory says that, yeah, law and morality are absolutely linked. For a law to be a real law, it has to be just. But in the other corner, you have legal positivism. And this side argues, nope, law and morality are totally separate things. A law is a law if it's made by the right people in the right way, doesn't matter if it's good or evil.
So let's dig into that first idea, the one that says law and morality can't be separated. This is the world of natural law theory.
Natural law theory isn't just about what's ethical. It's about the very definition of law itself. It says there's a higher standard out there, a kind of universal moral code that our human-made laws have to measure up to. And if a law fails that test, well, then it's not just a bad law. It might not be a law at all.
This idea is summed up perfectly by this famous quote from St. Augustine, which was later echoed by people like Martin Luther King Jr. An unjust law is no law at all. Now that is a powerful statement. It means that a rule that violates some fundamental moral principle, like a law that commands you to harm an innocent person, well, it just doesn't have the authority that makes something a law in the first place.
And this is not some new idea, not by a long shot. This goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers like the Stoics, and later on theologians like Thomas Aquinas, they all argued that there are these universal truths about right and wrong that any rational person can figure out. And these truths make up a kind of eternal, natural law that's way above any temporary laws made up by some king or government.
Okay, so let's flip the coin. Let's look at the other side of this argument, the one that says law has nothing to do with some higher moral code. Welcome to legal positivism.
For a legal positivist, the most important thing is that law is just a human invention. It's a social fact. So if you want to know if something is a valid law, you don't ask if it's moral. You ask, where did it come from? What's its pedigree? Was it passed through the correct channels by the people in charge? If the answer is yes, then it's a valid law. End of story. Good, bad, ugly, doesn't matter.
A really big name here is Thomas Hobbes. He was writing during the chaos of the English Civil War, and he basically said that without some powerful, absolute authority, what he called a sovereign, to lay down the rules, society would just collapse into a free-for-all. For Hobbes, the sovereign's command is the law.
And this classic quote perfectly captures why positivists think law is so important. Hobbes wasn't worried about whether the sovereign's laws were nice. He was worried about creating order out of what he called the violent state of nature. For him, pretty much any law was better than no law, because the alternative was a constant war of all against all.
Later on, another thinker named John Austin boiled this down to a really simple formula. What is law? It's just three things. 1, it's a command. 2, it comes from a sovereign, the boss everyone listens to. And 3, it's backed up by a threat, a punishment if you don't obey. That's it. Notice what's missing? Any mention of morality. Okay, so we've got our two competing theories on the table. Let's bring this back to that woman on trial in Germany after the war. How would each of these philosophies judge what she did? This very question set the stage for one of the most famous showdowns in the history of legal philosophy, a true clash of the titans that happened right after World War II. In one corner, you had H.L.A. Hart, a leading positivist. He said, look, that Nazi statute was morally repulsive, but technically, it was a valid law at the time it was made. He argued we have to keep the question of what law is separate from what law ought to be, or else things get really confusing. But in the other corner was Lon Fuller, a natural law guy.
He fired back that the entire Nazi regime was so fundamentally evil, so lacking in what he called an inner morality, that its rules didn't even deserve the name law. It wasn't a legal system. It was just brute force masquerading as one.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's an interesting historical debate about a really dark time in history. But that's where you'd be wrong. This argument is very much alive and kicking today.
This tension between thinking of law as a moral mission versus thinking of it as just a tool for order, it's right at the heart of some of the biggest legal and political fights we're having right now.
I mean, think about it. When we talk about universal human rights that no government is allowed to violate, that's pure natural law thinking. When we argue about whether a judge should just apply the letter of the law or try to find a more just outcome, we're right back in the Hart versus Fuller debate. Every time we ask about the limits of government power, or when it's okay to break a law you believe is unjust, we are wrestling with this exact same philosophical divide.
So, at the end of the day, the question, what is law, really forces us to ask an even bigger question. What is law for? Is its goal to build a just society that reflects some higher moral truth? Or is its main job just to keep order and protect us from that nasty, brutish world Hobbes was so afraid of? There's no easy answer, and how we choose to answer it says everything about the kind of world we want to live in.